In this video, we'll consider the second of the problems for ethics, the problem of relativism, as I've called it, or as I might say more conversationally, is ethics just a bunch of opinions? In order to discuss that, we need to talk about what an opinion is, and I'm going to do that using the following terms: fact versus opinion, and matter of fact versus matter of opinion. I'm going to define a fact as something that is true, and an opinion as a belief. You might notice something interesting about these two terms. There's nothing that prevents us from having an opinion about a fact. I can have an opinion about something that's true. Sometimes people act as if opinions and facts are totally in opposition, but in actuality, they're not. So what happens if we have an opinion about a fact? Our opinion would have to be either correct or incorrect. If we believe the fact is false, then our opinion would be incorrect. If we believed it was true, then our opinion would be correct. So for instance, if today is Saturday, which it is, and I believe it's Monday, then my opinion is incorrect. But if I believe it's Saturday, then my opinion is correct. In addition, there can be facts about opinions. For instance, a poll result, which shows us what people's opinions are, would be a fact about an opinion. So when students say that ethics is just a bunch of opinions, they are probably not referring to opinion in the way I just described it, because that definition of opinion is just a belief. And of course, people have beliefs about ethics. They have beliefs about all kinds of things. But I don't think students are trying to say that people have beliefs about ethics. What they're trying to say is that that's all they have. There's nothing more than beliefs. That's only opinions, and there's nothing more to it. And what we're going to use to express that idea is a matter of opinion. A matter of opinion means that something is nothing more than opinion. There's nothing more to it. So here are the two definitions we're going to give for these two expressions. A matter of fact is going to be a statement that's either true or false, but you don't have to know which it is. It's the kind of thing in principle that is true or false. But you may never know, because maybe it's something we can't get the answer to. For instance, whether or not extraterrestrials live 10 galaxies away, and maybe beyond our ability to ever get the answer to that. Whether or not something happened 500 years ago, we may never know what happened 500 years ago, because everybody who lived then is no longer with us, and it may not have been recorded in the record of history. But still, those things would be matters of fact, because either there are extraterrestrials or they're not, or something happened or it didn't happen. And another way of expressing this idea is that those statements are objective. A matter of opinion is going to be a statement that is either true or false depending on one's point of view. In other words, it could be true for me and false for you. It's subjective. It depends on one's point of view. So here are some examples of things that you can think about as being either matter of fact or matter of opinion. So take a few seconds to look it over. I'll start the answers in just a second. So Abraham Lincoln ate pork for dinner on this date in 1854. We have no answer available to us to tell us whether or not he did, but he either did or he didn't, so it's a matter of fact. The same with extraterrestrials exist somewhere else in the universe. Whether or not there's an omniscient God is a matter of fact. He either exists or he does not. Pumpkin pie is the best Thanksgiving dessert. Now, there's the first one that would more properly fit under matter of opinion, because everybody has their own personal taste. So matters of opinion are frequently thought of as being something that is related to the fields of taste. There's no disputing taste, is the famous statement. The earth is flat? Well, that's a false statement, but it's a matter of fact because it's either true or false. Grey's Anatomy is the best medical drama ever made. Seems to be a common opinion, but it is a matter of opinion because people have their own views about what makes a good drama, and there's no one right answer. If you say it's not and I say it is, there's really no way for us to say that the other person is incorrect. JFK acted alone when he killed John F. Kennedy. That should be not JFK, that should be Lee Harvey Oswald. He either did or he didn't. And Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster are real. Those two are matters of fact. They are not real as far as I know, but whether they're real or not is something that is a matter of fact. Here's another way of looking at it. When two people disagree about a matter of fact, they cannot both be correct. I'm right, you're wrong, or you're right, I'm wrong. If two people disagree about a matter of opinion, they can both be correct. I'm right for me, you're right for you. So what typically belongs in each category? Put ethics aside for a minute. So science and history are generally typical of matters of fact. Taste in food, fashion, and art are typical of matters of opinion. But where does ethics fit in? Moral objectivists put all ethical statements and claims under the category matter of fact. On the other hand, moral subjectivists put all ethical statements and claims under matter of opinion. That's a type of what's called relativism. We're going to look at another type, cultural relativism, in a few minutes. So there are different views in the field of philosophy. You can be an ethical objectivist or a moral objectivist and believe that ethical statements are matters of fact, that there are moral facts, or you could be a relativist and think that it's all a matter of individual opinion. The key here is to understand what each view means and what holding a particular view commits you to. To give a little further detail, moral objectivism doesn't mean that we have to know what the facts are right now. It doesn't mean that we would know everything about morality or ethics at the moment. We don't know everything about biology or astronomy. And it also doesn't mean we're all going to agree. The fact that we disagree about ethical questions does not mean that they're matters of opinion, because we disagree about things in science too, or about history. And in the past, we had profound disagreements about science. At one time, Galileo got in trouble for arguing that the Earth revolved around the sun. But that didn't mean that was a matter of opinion. It just meant that the truth was not known, so there were disagreements. And in the same way, a moral objectivist would say the truth is not yet known about all ethical questions. Moral subjectivism, on the other hand, which holds that all ethical statements or claims are matters of opinion, leads to some very interesting consequences, as we will see later. By the way, you don't have to have all ethical claims in the same category here. Some claims you may think belong under matter of opinion, and others you may think belong under matter of fact. So you could take a few minutes and think about some different possibilities of things you would put in one category or the other. I chose 2, and you can try to add in 3 more. The 2 I chose are one that I clearly, strongly feel is a matter of fact. It's wrong to murder for fun. I think that's a moral fact. And another one that I happen to think is a matter of opinion. I don't think there's a right or wrong about standards of dress. I think that's culturally controlled, and I don't have a strong opinion about how people should dress. And so I think if people want to be a nudist and belong to a nudist colony, I don't feel like that's an ethical problem. So I would put one under one extreme and the other under the other extreme. So you can think about how you would do with those and with 3 others. As you're doing that, be aware that this is not a continuum from ethical to unethical. I'm not talking about what's right and what's wrong. I'm talking about what is the kind of thing that there would be an answer to, and what is the kind of thing that would have no answer, that is timeless and universal for all people. Remember that just because people in the past disagreed on the claim does not mean it's a matter of opinion. People disagreed on the past on all kinds of matters of fact, like many people thought that the sun revolved around the earth. Be aware that a matter of opinion means that no matter what a person thinks they're right, they can never be wrong, no matter what they believe, no matter how extreme their belief is. And you can put all of them on one corner or the other if you want, but think about what that means where you're putting it. Now, I told you there was another type of relativism, and I'm going to briefly discuss that. This other type of relativism is called cultural relativism, and it's different. One way to understand cultural relativism is to think about three levels. The first level, the lowest level, is going to be individual people like me and you. Then the next level up will be cultures, society, the United States, for instance. And then the highest level will be whatever is above society, if anything is. And for a religious person, this would be God. For a non-religious person, this might be a higher moral truth or standard that's higher than a particular culture or society. So we're going to consider, what if each of these levels were to have the power to determine good and evil, right and wrong, moral and immoral. So if we take the lowest level, what of the views we've studied describes if somebody at this level was the determinative force who got to decide what right and wrong were? If you said subjectivism, you got it right, because in subjectivism, each person determines right or wrong for them individual selves. There's nothing outside of the individual that can tell you that you're wrong about what you believe about ethics and morality. So let's say that the highest level determines what right and wrong are. Remember, the highest level is for a religious person, God. For a non-religious person, it's a standard, a kind of universal standard that exists above society. So if you said objectivism, you got that right. Objectivism is the idea that there's some standard for right and wrong which exists above human beings. It's kind of like discovering scientific facts by looking at the external world. In the same way, looking outside of human beings, we can uncover facts about morality outside of individual people, but also outside of culture and society. Now, let's look at that middle level. If it determines right and wrong, then we have what is called cultural relativism. So according to cultural relativism, an action is right or wrong if your society says it is right or wrong. That means, unlike with subjectivism, a person could be morally wrong in their actions. A person can be morally wrong in cultural relativism. They're right or wrong if their society says they're right or wrong. So if their society has a moral law and the person breaks it, then they would be morally wrong. So this leads to a situation where the same action would be right or wrong depending on where or when it was performed. So there's an example from the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, which is frequently used. In the example, there are two cultures, with the Greeks and the Calaitians. The Greeks believe it is moral to burn the dead. The Calaitians do not believe that. They think it's immoral. So if you take four people, two of whom were Greek and two of whom were Calaitian, in this case, Anne and Stan, and then James and Elizabeth. Not very Greek/Calaitian names, but there you are. And Anne and James bury their dead, and Stanley and Elizabeth do not. So according to ethical relativism, two of these people are right and two are wrong. It is James and Stanley, because James burns his dead, but he's a Calaitian, and the Calaitians do not burn their dead. And Stanley is Greek, but he does not burn the dead, which the Greeks do. So many people today might put rules about how the dead are to be handled under matter of opinion, because they might think that all these different practices are equally valid, and it's partly the point of view of the person who holds them, even up into freezing or shooting people into space, which I think is something people can now do if they want to. And here I have the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who will be discussing in the next video, who asked to have his body preserved and put on public display after his death, and that is his skeleton is stuffed into the clothing. The face is a wax figurine because they weren't able to perfectly preserve the face. But again, you might think that that's fine. If somebody wants to do that, there's not a single right answer about that. So that example may not be the best one for trying to see if there are any limitations to cultural relativism, because it might be a practice about which many people are relativistic today. They don't think there's a right answer. So let's pick something about which more people believe strongly in a right answer in the present day. So infanticide was practiced by the ancient Romans for a variety of different reasons. And it was generally considered to be an acceptable practice. So I'm going to use that one. I'm going to have two ancient Romans, Augustus and Livia, and Joel and Sarah are going to be my Americans. Augustus is married to Sarah, the American. They're cross-temporally married and they live in the United States. Livia and Joel are also cross-temporally married and they live in Pompeii, circa 21 before the Common Era. Livia and Augustus think infanticide is morally acceptable. Their partners do not. Who is right and who is wrong? So I think you can see in this case that Livia would be right because Livia is living in Pompeii. Augustus would be wrong because Augustus is living in the United States. And Joel and Sarah, Joel is married to Livia, so he would be wrong, and Sarah would be correct. So that's, of course, assuming it depends on where you live and not where you were born, which is kind of another complication. What should it be based on? Then Augustus, what if he changes his mind under his spouse's influence? Does he become right then? And does Livia become right? What if they get divorced and move back to their previous countries? Would they suddenly become wrong again unless they change their mind back to what they previously believed? These complications seem to raise a lot of issues for how right and wrong are determined within cultural relativism. I encourage you to think about other circumstances in which cultural relativism is problematic. A couple examples that come to mind are foot binding and female circumcision, and I'm sure there are many others. Philosophers generally find cultural relativism problematic for a variety of reasons. It seems to prevent anyone from criticizing the action of any culture at any time, no matter what they're doing. Including cultures that might be doing something like committing a genocide, because the culture determines right or wrong for itself, so there's no grounds upon which you can criticize the culture. Sometimes people are under the impression that cultural relativism works against ethnocentrism and that objectivism somehow leads to ethnocentrism, but actually the contrary is true. If I'm an objectivist, it means that I believe there's a right answer to something. It doesn't mean that my answer or my culture's answer is necessarily the right answer. And it makes it possible for me to judge my culture's answer and say maybe it's incorrect, looking to a higher standard that might help me to see why it's incorrect. So if I reject cultural relativism, I'm not saying that my culture's right. But if I accept it, I have to accept that my culture's right. So it actually leads to ethnocentrism rather than the reverse. Another issue is not only being able to criticize cultures outside, but being able to criticize a culture from within. If the culture defines what right is, how can moral change take place? There's no grounds upon which one could criticize the culture and try to engage in action to change it. And here you have a selection from Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King. In this, Martin Luther King is corresponding with people who agree with his goals, but they don't necessarily agree with his methods, the methods of civil disobedience. So he was writing to some of the moderates who were resisting the idea of civil disobedience in order to try to change some of the segregation laws in the South. And he was making the argument that it's reasonable to suggest that some laws be broken and other laws be obeyed. And the reason for this was because there was a Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation in the public schools. And some of the segregationists were breaking the law or wanted to break the law in order to resist that Supreme Court decision. So it seems like, Dr. King says here, it seems paradoxical because to advocate breaking some laws and at the same time advocate obeying others. And his answer is that there are two types of laws, just and unjust, and that just laws should be followed and obeyed, and unjust laws should be disobeyed. In fact, one has a moral responsibility to do that. In other words, civil disobedience to fight against segregation is the right thing to do, and but on the other hand, breaking the laws to fight against desegregation is the wrong thing to do. Now, how would one know that? You couldn't look at the law itself, because the law itself is what is at stake, and the law itself is incorrect in this area. So what you have to do is you have to look to a higher law, and that higher law or standard is something that you use to judge and evaluate the human or cultural law. So he's referring here to something that's above the law by which we judge the law. And it's in reference to that higher law that one is able to engage in change within society to resist the legal standards of one's culture when they are mistaken. So without having an idea of that higher standard, it becomes harder to see how resistance within the culture could develop. So here we see some of the problems that generally have been mentioned with regard to cultural relativism. It makes it harder to engage in criticisms of societies no matter what they're doing. We could see if our society was right or wrong just by looking at our laws, which seems to suggest that our laws couldn't be mistaken or criticized. It calls into doubt the idea of moral progress, because although there could be change in the rules that we live by, we used to commit infanticide and now we no longer do in the world. Although there are changes, they can't really be called improvements, because there's no standard by which you can say that we're getting better or worse. All we ever have is one law that passes after another, but there's nothing that's any better or worse. And that seems to conflict with the idea that we think our moral changes are not arbitrary, but they're based on good reasons. How do we even decide what's right or wrong if we're a cultural relativist? Is it by majority rule? What if it's 49-51? Do we focus on what we actually do or what we say we do? Because that can be very different. Adultery is generally frowned upon, and yet it's widely committed. So how do we decide right and wrong? Based on our actions or what we say? How do we define a culture? Isn't there more than one culture in the United States? Can individual groups, very small groups, be independent cultures setting up their more moral rules? What if one person decides that they're a culture? In the end, that would collapse down into subjectivism, because if each person could be their own culture and decide rules for themselves, how is that different from subjectivism itself? So that brings us back to subjectivism. So let's talk about its potential problems. So the biggest problem is that we can never criticize what someone else does, no matter how horrible it might be. If it's right for them, then it's right. We can try to stop them if it's right for us to do so, but that's it. We can't do any more than that. We can't say why it's wrong, because there is no why it's wrong. It's all a matter of just personal preference. So we can give moral justifications if we want, but they're not important. We're not required to have them, and they have nothing to do with making an action right or wrong. So they're kind of pointless. All that really matters in the end is choosing or selecting our moral belief. We don't need to be able to defend it. There's no defense necessary, and the defense is totally irrelevant. But we normally think we do have reasons for our beliefs, and we do things because of those reasons, not just randomly by choosing. Finally, it doesn't seem like we really act as if we're relativists. We really act as if we do believe our moral actions are motivated by good reasons. So, for instance, just as in a case where somebody was trying to jump off a building and they seem to think they could fly, we would stop them because we think they're factually incorrect. In the same way, if someone comes to us and tells us they're going to commit a morally heinous act, we would try to stop them. We would get help. We would call the police. We would call some sort of official that could help the situation, because we think that there's something wrong about that point of view. We don't act like it's just a matter of personal preference. To sum up, subjectivists believe there's no moral code outside the self. It's all just a matter of personal preference and personal choice, and nobody can ever be wrong. There are never any right answers. So, an objectivist believes that there are right answers, that there is some kind of code, that we can give reasons for our moral beliefs. But even if you're inclined towards being an objectivist, you still might have a few questions. What exactly is this moral code? How do we find out what it is? Where do we begin looking for moral reasons and for moral justifications for different points of view? What kinds of justifications, reasons, evidence, and proof can we give? What do we do when people disagree? How are we going to resolve them? Why do people disagree so much if there is a right answer to ethical questions? So we're going to proceed to discuss different possible theories about that over the course of the next 3 videos and the next week or so.